Sarah Chambers is a special ed student. Her town is paying $72,000 a year for her education. In a second town,
we have one student whose tuition is $180,000 a year. There are people who will say, why are we doing this?
special ed parents fighting a system that fights back.
It's mind-boggling what people have to go through.
Schools turned into battlegrounds where both sides lose.
It begins to pit parents of children with disabilities against those without.
Inside special education, a special report, next on Chronicle.
Good evening. If money grew on trees, then special education would not cause the controversy it does in communities all across the state.
But well-funded or not, school districts in every city and town must follow state and federal laws that require a free and appropriate public education for every child with special needs.
The wind came by and gave an angry frown, and one little apple came tumbling down.
4-year-old Cameron Peake of Shrewsbury and his twin sister Charlotte love school, and their mother loves that they're in public school.
They're in with the other kids and enjoying it, and just where I would want them to be right now. When they were 2 pounds, I didn't know what to expect when they were 4.
The twins were born prematurely at 7 months. From birth, they progressed well thanks to early intervention. When they entered school at 3, special education kicked in.
Charlotte has mild cerebral palsy, so she has braces on both of her legs. She didn't speak until she was 3.
Cameron, too, has language delay. He receives speech therapy and Charlotte physical therapy. She also has a full-time aide.
Last year she wasn't walking on her own, and now she's walking on her own. When he came here, he was using sign language, and now he is talking sentences and typical 4-year-old.
Nice job!
This is how special education is supposed to work. Children learning in public schools in their communities. Shrewsbury Special Ed Director Ellen Myers.
You want kids to be in their home school with their peers, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. Depends on who the child is, depends on what their special needs are.
Sorry, it's Wednesday, not Friday.
15-year-old Sarah Chambers of Pepperell, who has high-functioning autism, was miserable in her public school.
I was extremely shy or didn't have that many friends. Very little and stuff.
Sarah alarmed her mother Ellen when she began writing pleading notes and talking in desperate terms.
And talked about bombing the school, and talked about smashing her teacher's glasses, and talked about ripping up all her papers. This was her only way of telling us, I'm not okay.
Sarah's special ed team recommended a private school outside the district, but the principal resisted, says Chambers, pushing instead for a low-level life skills program.
The principal's response to this difficulty was to lower the bar for her.
The school finally agreed to send Sarah to Murphy and Dwyer Academy in Chelmsford, which specializes in autism. These are students prone to anxiety, and that can make them act out.
In public schools, they would have been kids that would have been pulled out of or carried out of classrooms by staff and then put into behavioral classrooms or put into are suspended.
With only 10 students and half as many teachers, every piece of their day is broken down into manageable parts. A student in danger of losing control is offered a respectful out and a chance to calm down.
Instead of saying, you need to leave the classroom, which you is a confrontational word, you say, could you help me out? Would you go walk Ginger for me? They never ever say no.
So far I'm on this.
A once despondent 4th grader unable to learn, Sarah Chambers is now an eager, college-bound freshman. But her mother had to fight to make that happen. Why? Special education is expensive. Tuition at Murphy and Dwyer is $90,000. Sarah's transportation an additional $25,000 for a total of $115,000. The state kicks in about $43,000, leaving the school district with a bill for $72,000 a year. Compare that to the district's average cost of $8,600 per pupil.
Special education costs have risen I would say twice as fast as regular education costs over the past 15 years.
Shrewsbury Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Tony Bent, has had to resort to student fees to balance his budget.
Parents pay $210 for their child to ride a bus, $290 for a child to participate in sports, and we have activities fees, $100 at the high school, $50 at the middle schools.
Fees go down hard in most communities, but so do higher property taxes, and they're the main source of school funding.
People get angry about the special education budget. They don't like the idea of it. And every once in a while I want to turn around and say, there but for the grace of God go you.
Must be so difficult, Anthony, when you think about how do parents know that their children are getting the help they need?
Well, it's very difficult. It's an emotional issue, it's a financial issue, and it's a time issue as well. In fact, we know of at least one mother who had to give up her job just in order to oversee her son's education. A lot of people like that. We'll have more about that in just 70 seconds. Jason Robison got hooked on recycling at Lincoln Sudbury High School, where he also helped out the school band. His sister Amy belonged to the drama club.
If I had told you those were things I expected of them when they were young, your response to me probably would have been, here's a very unrealistic parent.
Rich Robison's children thrived in public schools. When Amy had a graduation party, everyone showed up.
The popular kids, the smart kids, initially we were like falling all over ourselves, well, thank you for coming to our party, blah, blah, blah. And they said, you don't understand, Mr. Robison. When we got to know Amy, she has so changed us.
As head of the Federation for Children with Special Needs, Robison guides parents through the maze of accessing special ed services.
To arrange the appropriate services that your particular child needs is not an easy or simple proposition.
A nightmare is how Bonnie Polikoff of Concord describes getting help for her son Simon's learning disability.
You have to ask, you have to know how to ask, you have to know in what language to use, you have to know when you have to put it in writing, how to put it in writing, who to address it to. There are meetings where you often don't understand what's being said.
The Concord schools did their best, says Polikoff, but she had to be so vigilant she was forced to shut down her thriving marketing business and still needed help.
I ended up having to hire an advocate at $90 an hour, basically to help me figure out the things that I needed to ask for, how to evaluate whether Simon was making effective progress.
Ellen Chambers knows the frustrations as well.
Falling behind in all his classes, even.
Chambers is a former advocate, and every week she hears from another desperate parent complaining that their school is stonewalling them.
They're going to their school district. Clearly, you know, their child's in trouble. The school district is telling them their child is fine.
Chambers founded SPEDWatch to monitor violations of the special ed law, which she says are rampant.
I actually did a study of about 200 school districts and found that roughly 3/4 of them aren't following regulations with regard to testing children.
I don't think administrators sometimes understand the consequences of not following the regulations.
Dr. Anthony Laverty, a psychologist for the Newton school system, sees cursory evaluations that end up hurting students.
You might have a student that you've assessed and has a learning disability, but then if you looked into it more closely, you'd also find out that they have an emotional disability.
And emotional disabilities, left untreated, get worse as time goes on.
When you interview the young gal that tells you that from 3rd grade, she felt lonely. She started feeling sad. And now by her sophomore year of high school, for instance, she's cutting herself or thinking of suicide. Sometimes it's simple as just adding a counseling component, which is a very economical way of treating the problem.
Even critics agree schools want to do right by students, but too often, they say, a child with special needs is seen as a child who costs more.
We're not investing in the stock market here. We're investing community resources into building our communities, and communities are made up of diverse people.
Words can sting, and parents of special needs kids have heard it all.
We hear from them right after this. Decades ago, they were called feeble-minded, warehoused in institutions, often with no education at all. These appalling conditions gave rise to special education laws.
These are really civil rights laws as a result of a long history, 100-year-old history of segregating individuals with disabilities and keeping them isolated in our society.
But critics say the pendulum has swung too far. Ellen Myers understands their concerns.
We have one student whose tuition is $180,000 a year. Is that fair? I'm not going to comment on whether that's fair or not. That's what it is.
What's more, Shrewsbury spends almost $1 million a year on transportation alone for 75 students. But don't blame special education as the only budget buster, says Rich Robison.
There's health care, there's oil, there's utilities, there's all kinds of things that are causing school budgets to go out of whack.
Did you get bubbles on the outside of the micro well?
Simon Polikoff of Concord goes to Eagle Hill, a school for the learning disabled in central Massachusetts. He just couldn't keep up in public school, says mother Bonnie Polikoff.
As hard as they were trying, the system was not working for him.
What Simon thrived on was soccer, but that wasn't to be at Concord Carlisle High School.
I had a head of athletics tell me that Simon would really not be allowed to play soccer on the school team because slow processing would make him dangerous on the soccer field.
At Eagle Hill, Simon plays varsity soccer and takes honors classes.
My son knows how lucky he is, and we know how lucky we are as a family.
What hurts, though, are resentful comments. Bonnie Polikoff recalls one mother in her town who didn't know Simon had special needs.
And she basically started complaining about how all of these special ed students, get so much and are taking things away from the wonderful students, the brilliant students who, after all, are going to be the leaders of the world.
The tragedy of the whole situation is that the system is set up such that it begins to pit parents of children with disabilities against those without in this scramble for these few educational dollars that we can get our hands on.
One of the costliest disabilities to treat is also one of the fastest growing, autism. 10 years ago, it was rare, 1 in 10,000. Today, it is 1 in 150.
The term epidemic, to me, is an appropriate term. It's having a significant impact on school systems. It's certainly having a significant impact on Shrewsbury.
Ellen Myers has 5 classrooms of autistic students in Shrewsbury and will probably add a 6th next year. Superintendent Tony Bent says the savings in transportation alone are worth the investment.
Frequently, the transportation costs of sending a child to a distant place in Massachusetts equal or exceed the tuition of that student.
Nice job.
Also fueling special education is the survival of more premature babies.
It's wonderful that these children are being saved, these very, very young babies. Very few survive without some kind of learning issue.
Sisters Gina Gallagher and Patty Conjoyan have been through the special needs wars. Katie Gallagher has Asperger's, a form of high-functioning autism. Her cousin, Jen Conjoyan, has bipolar disorder.
When my daughter would tell me what happened at school, I'd tuck her in at night, and she'd tell me, and she'd be so strong, I'd leave her room and I'd go cry.
But it's laughter that gets these sisters through. They've written a book poking fun at a society preoccupied with perfection.
Shut up, just shut up, shut up.
There were times when we did want to say, oh, shut up about your perfect kid, because we want to talk about our imperfect kids and why we're proud of them.
The mothers are fighting back against those bragging bumper stickers.
They have, my honor student loves me, and we have, my bipolar kid loves me and hates me.
They share small victories most parents take for granted.
When my daughter tied her shoe for the first time, she might have been 9, I thought it was the greatest day of my life. I think people generally, it's not that they don't care about our kids, they don't know how to talk about our kids.
So these mothers and daughters are leading the way.
Jen Conjoyan has bipolar disorder. Katie Gallagher has Asperger's, but you know what? They're still bright. They're still good friends. They're good kids. They're interesting kids. Don't be afraid to get to know them because of a label.
Shut up, just shut up, shut up, shut up, just shut up.
And you can link up to Gina and Patty's website, which sounds just terrific, by going to thebostonchannel.com. And we have other websites related to special education also on our website.
And that sense of humor certainly helps along the way. Frank Talk with a school superintendent when Chronicle continues.
Joining us now, Carla Baer, Superintendent of Lowell Schools, to help us tonight to understand this issue more.
You head up a very large school system. Budget issues obviously are a big concern, but you look at special ed costs, they continue to rise. Nobody really wants to have a Prop 2.5 override every couple of years. So how do you balance those competing forces?
Well, with difficulty.
Imagine.
There are a number of, besides special education, energy costs are rising, transportation costs are rising, health insurance costs are rising. So there are an enormous number of pressures on school budgets. In the case of special education, superintendents have the job of advocating for all students. Under the law, special education students identified with special needs have certain rights under the law, and so their programs are in a way protected in the budget. We have to build that. They're a given in the budget. We have to build that first. And so then dealing with the limits on the funds available means that sometimes some very tough choices have to be made.
Because if you don't get the funding from Prop 2.5 overrides, you're cutting services, I imagine, in some programs, no?
That's right. I mean, you have choices of cutting services, figuring out ways to do things more efficiently, figuring out ways to collaborate with others to do services. So I think all those strategies are strategies that we have to use as superintendents.
It seems that in-house programs are more cost efficient and maybe are a new trend. But if that's so, why aren't more school districts going that route?
I think a lot of school districts are. I think we added 3 separate programs in the last 2 years. We figured out that we could save almost $1 million a year by creating a high school program for youngsters with significant special needs, emotional and cognitive disabilities. And we closed an elementary school, merged the children to a nearby elementary school, and reopened that school so that it could serve an adolescent population that otherwise we'd be serving outside and paying transportation and tuition costs
and
for.
that's probably so much better for the students and their families, too, to have them closer to home.
They want to be closer to home, absolutely.
From a taxpayer's perspective, though, to play devil's advocate here a little bit, aren't these really human service or health needs that are sort of by default, we're talking about emotional and physical disabilities, that are by default ending up in the school budget?
The schools have increasingly become sort of the place of last resort, and we're expected to meet a whole range of needs, as you suggest, not just educational needs. And there are other agencies that need to be picking up part of these costs, absolutely.
And Superintendent, how do you keep from any rancor developing between parents who say, hey, I wanted that money to go to the music program or the football team, or what do you do to educate your parents?
Well, it is a challenge because there are some tensions and there are adversarial relationships, I think, that can easily develop among parents and also, of course, between parents and school staff. School staff look at their programs. We think they're great programs. When a parent says, no, I want my youngster to be out of district in a placement, a lot of times our staff is saying, wait, our program is really great, give it a chance. It's a tremendous challenge, but one that we always have to keep focused on what's in the best needs of youngsters and try to get people focused on that.
Thank you for your time. We don't envy your position. We know how difficult it is and how many competing interests you have to balance. So we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you very much.
My pleasure being here.
Thanks.
Do you have your own thoughts on special education? You can join our forum about that on thebostonchannel.com.
And you can also watch an extended interview with Special Education Director Ellen Myers. Just go to Chronicle's page on thebostonchannel.com. And that's it for us. I'm Mary Richardson. Thanks for being with us tonight.
And I'm Anthony Everett. Have a great weekend. We'll see you again on Monday night.
Good night.